The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Mounting widespread protests on the streets of Israel this week got action. But the roiling domestic politics remain and raise lots of questions about the health of the current coalition government led by Bibi Netanyahu. Tonight, we'll find out where things stand and where they may be headed. Then, our Ontario hubs explain why people want to know how to spot a fake Norval Morrisseau painting. And from why some students are missing more school to how diaspora communities contend with foreign interference. We've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, March 31st, and that's all ahead on the Agenda. Earlier this week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in a nationally televised address, "When there's an opportunity to avoid civil war through dialogue, I, as Prime Minister, am taking a time out for dialogue." Such words highlight the seriousness of the situation after massive, protracted protests in Israel just won a delay to a controversial overhaul of the judiciary. It's drawn attention to the domestic issues involved and from allies on the outside looking in. With us now for a look at this crisis, we're welcoming in Jerusalem, Israel, Yaakov Katz, editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, and here in our studio, Janice Stein, the Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management and founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Janice, as always, great to have you in that chair. Yaakov, welcome to our program. It's good to meet you. For those coming to this subject for the first time, Yaakov, can you just give us a sense about what the judicial changes are that the Prime Minister has been pushing for that have been so controversial?
Well, there are basically, Steve, three main pieces of legislation that the Prime Minister, together with his far-right coalition, wanted to implement over the last few months and came up against fierce opposition from the Israeli center and the Israeli left, as well as hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are taking to the streets on a weekly basis. Almost about 3% of Israel's entire population were out on the streets. But the three pieces of legislation, one was how our Supreme Court justice is chosen. The coalition wanted to get an exclusive majority in the appointments committee that would give it the authority to appoint the Supreme Court justices without needing necessarily to take any input from the justices themselves or from the opposition. The second piece of legislation, as you know in Canada was called the Override Bill, a law that would have allowed the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, to re-legislate laws that were struck down by the Supreme Court. And they wanted to do that with a simple majority, not a supermajority. And the third piece of legislation was that they wanted to pass a law that would basically allow them to categorize or designate pieces of legislation as laws that the Supreme Court cannot even touch, laws that the Supreme Court cannot even review. So altogether, those were the three main pieces of legislation, part of the reform.
Great. Yeah, you call it an override clause there. We call it the notwithstanding clause in our Constitution here. Janice, that is, as Yaakov suggests, not a situation, number two anyway, not a situation unknown to us in Canada. So why has this been seen as such a threat to democracy in Israel?
You know, it's really interesting, Steve. None of those three elements that Yaakov just summarized are by themselves unknown in democratic practice. Here's the two reasons why this provoked a civil uprising. First of all, Israel has no written constitution. So we do, and a notwithstanding clause could be a problem, but they have no basic Bill of Rights and no written constitution. So 61 out of 120 votes to override really empowers any coalition government, frankly, to do anything it wants. That's a real problem. The second big one, and this is very un-Israeli, is there was no process here. This government was elected, came to office, rammed or proposed to ram this legislation through in 2 months. You don't do judicial reform. If you're concerned about an activist Supreme Court or an imbalance, you do what we do in Canada. You appoint a commission. The commission studies it. It holds hearings. It is the absence of anything approaching a fair process here, which just infuriated people.
Yaakov, you mentioned how many people have been in the streets protesting, 3% of the entire country's population. Can you give us a sense of who that is? Because obviously if it's only people who hate the prime minister, that's one thing. If it goes beyond that, that's something else. What is it?
I think it's a combination of a lot of different demographics and sectors of Israeli society. I think it could be at the core people who have been opposed to the prime minister, to Benjamin Netanyahu, for a number of years and were actively seeking to try to bring him down. And they were upset that he won in the November 1 election and was able to form this very right-wing, very religious, very ultra-nationalist coalition. But I think that might be part of it, but that's not it. That's not what is enough to sustain such a long protest of 3 months straight, 12 weeks. You know, I tell people, you could think about it in Canada for a moment, but, you know, if you look at the numbers, can you imagine 1 million people of your population every week taking to the streets and protesting against what's happening in their country? Can you imagine in the United States, 8-9 million people every week for 3 months protesting? So the number might sound small to some people, but this was big, and it was for Israel, and it really showed a great sense of distress among people in this country who felt that we were slipping away from being a liberal democracy. We were slipping towards becoming an authoritarian democracy.
I think the short answer to your question is no. We certainly can't imagine that here. Just a quick follow-up, though, Yaakov. Israeli Arabs, would they have been part of the coalition protesting these changes?
So the Israeli Arabs are not, they weren't actively on the streets necessarily, and they're not currently in the government's coalition, but they are in the opposition in the Knesset, and they were also fiercely opposed to what the coalition was trying to do. Because look, they have a fear. We have 2 million of our 10 million citizens in this country are Israeli Arabs. They are a minority, and their concern was that with these pieces of legislation, what would basically happen, as Janice said, is it's not each on their own, but all together. What this does is gives a really unprecedented exclusive authority and power to the governing coalition. Because what people need to remember is that while we have 3 branches of government, like many other countries, we have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary. Once the legislative branch is formed, there's elections, in the Knesset, in the parliament. Out of the legislative branch, the executive branch is formed. So the prime minister builds his or her coalition from the members of the Knesset. So there's no daylight between those two. They don't balance each other out. The only branch left is the judicial branch. And the Israeli Arabs, legitimately, as a minority, would fear that the coalition can do whatever it wants and could take away rights, for example.
Janice, I'd like to know, after Prime Minister Netanyahu insisted for months that this was going ahead full steam, why he, at the 11th hour, backed down.
Well, it was the nature of the opposition. And really key here, Steve, was the opposition from the reserve element of the Israeli army.
That's everybody.
That's everybody in the country. And the group that really started the snowball down for him were reserve Air Force pilots who said they would not report for reserve duty, unprecedented. It spread to armored corps commanders. You know, this has never happened. And the prime minister labeled these people refuseniks and argued that it was unprecedented, blamed the minister of defense that he dismissed but didn't dismiss for tolerating this kind of behavior. But did that strike a chord among a public that, as you just said, includes everybody? Layer on top of that, Joe Biden came out swinging. And even for Bibi Netanyahu, that combination was just too much. I'm gonna say right now, I think this is a tactical delay, nothing more.
Well, you mentioned Joe Biden, so let me pick up on that, because the Prime Minister of Israel did put out this tweet. Israel is a sovereign country which makes its decisions by the will of its people and not based on pressures from abroad, including from the best of friends.
Yeah.
Okay, Yaakov, who was that aimed at, as if we don't know?
That was aimed at, as Janice said, at the President of the United States, Joe Biden, right? I think what happened here was really a combination of the reservists, of the high-tech workers who also came out in big numbers. There were high-tech companies in Israel, and we know that Israel's high-tech industry is so important, who gave their employees time off to go protest against these judicial reforms. And then you had the prime minister traveling around Europe. He was yet to be invited to the United States. He was in Paris, and he was in Rome, and he was in Berlin, and he went to London. And all of these places, heads of state would say to him, Netanyahu, we're concerned with what's happening inside your country. And then there was Biden, who at the top of it said, I am not inviting Netanyahu in the near term, and I want to see him not go down this road. Now, we have to remember is that the Israeli-U.S. alliance is far greater than what people tend to look at it. It is about military intelligence sharing. It is about military aid. It is about knowing that Israel can rely on the United States at the UN Security Council to veto anti-Israel Security Council resolutions. It is about knowing that you have America in your corner when you need to pick up the phone and there's some crisis somewhere on the globe. And if you don't have that, if those shared values that the United States views as Israel having have changed, then we might be in big trouble. So altogether, I think Netanyahu got the memo and realized, I got to stop because this is not going in a good place.
You know, why he needed the memo is beyond me. This is I just don't get it. This is a prime minister who spent a huge amount of time in the United States. How could he not see this coming, Steve?
What about Canada? Has Prime Minister Trudeau had anything to say about this, either publicly or privately?
Well, there was. The Minister of Foreign Affairs did talk about how important democratic values are. And they are clearly watching this with concern, Steve. But, you know, for Bibi Netanyahu, there's one government above all that matters here.
U.S.
Yeah, and really, Joe Biden stepped out swinging here. He went beyond the usual diplomatic niceties.
You know, Yaakov, Prime Minister Netanyahu is in a very tough spot right now because, on the one hand, there are so many millions of people who are opposing these reforms that he wants to bring in. On the other hand, he has an even more right-wing flank of his coalition government, which includes the ultra-Orthodox, who very much want to see this happen, and presumably who could topple his government if he doesn't do these reforms. Where's his road forward?
I think that is the million-dollar question, Steve. And I think, like Janice said, where was Netanyahu? How did he miss this? Well, I think the answer is connects to your question. And Netanyahu today is in a very problematic place. On the one hand, he's facing this very right-wing coalition that wants to change the state of Israel, came with a very strong far-right ideology. On the other hand, he has his trial, right? Let's not forget, the man is on trial for severe corruption charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. So when he is presented with the dilemma of maybe lose your coalition, and then you'll just be like any regular defendant on the bench, or stay as prime minister, but you're going to have to pay the price to your coalition partners, even if it comes at the expense of ripping this country apart at the seams, creating an unprecedented foundation crisis with your allies like Canada, the United States, the UK, and others. Well, survival is always going to be the basic instinct sometimes for a politician. And I think that that's what Netanyahu went back for. So where his path forward, I think now, is to try to reach a compromise, right? He's delayed the legislation until after the Passover holiday and until the Knesset resumes at the end of April, beginning of May. And there's talks going on. The president of Israel is hosting those talks. Can they reach a compromise? Are these talks sincere? That time will tell. But if they can reach a compromise, then I think it's possible for both sides to walk out of this with some, not everyone happy, but also not everyone feeling like they lost.
Yeah, I'm much more pessimistic than that. But let me just backtrack for 1 second. You said the ultra-Orthodox in the coalition. It's not only the ultra-Orthodox. It is non-Orthodox right-wing nationalists who are using this as a battering ram to weaken, frankly, the already weak protection that the Supreme Court has accorded to Palestinians who petitioned the court over and over on a whole set of issues, Steve. That is the quiet, unspoken thing in this whole protest, that we have a tenth of the population out on the streets for liberal democratic rights, but not for Palestinian rights. And once you bring up the word Palestinian, that coalition splits apart and fractures.
Here is something that Yaakov recently wrote in the Jerusalem Post, expressing concern that Israel was becoming increasingly isolated and isolationist on the world stage. Sheldon, bottom of page 3, here we go. Israel, you write, is not just like any country. Unlike Finland, Sweden, or Australia, Israel is, against its desire, constantly engaged in conflict. As a result, it is in need of international support to not only fight, but to prevent negative diplomatic moves in international institutions. Okay, you say this is obvious on the face of it, Yaakov, but how obvious is this to the face of Netanyahu's supporters who don't seem to be getting it right now?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I don't think they get that nuance, and they don't understand necessarily the consequences of what's been happening here, right? Israel, because of the type of country that we are, because of the fact that, yes, Israel has to fight more than your average country, we do rely on the widest international support that we can get as a nation. And the moment that that starts to fray, that will undermine your ability to actually defend yourself moving forward. For example, the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the moment that they feel that Israel could be vulnerable, they will start to come after Israeli reservists, Israeli soldiers, officers, government officials who participate in anti-terror operations, whether they're in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. Is that what Israel wants? Of course not. But, you talk to these supporters of Netanyahu, they buy into the claim that, no, this was just about restructuring. This was about making the Israeli democracy stronger. This was about strengthening institutions. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. This was much more about demolishing institutions, and this was about restructuring in order to help his own personal trouble, as well as to satisfy his coalition partners. But you're right, Steve, that this was a nuance that a lot of people, I think, missed.
Janice, as you look at the chessboard that is the Middle East, is this controversy changing alliances currently?
We are at a very dangerous moment, Steve, and I can only layer on the risks here. First of all, as a concession that Netanyahu made on his way to delay, he gave one of the most fanatically right-wing ministers the right to form, frankly, what we can only call a militia. Now, you know what road you're walking down when you start to do that. Hopefully, I'm relying on the fact that this minister is just a terrible organizer, and it will take a very, it's incompetence. But that is a terrible precedent. Secondly, there's no question that Hamas is watching this, Hezbollah is watching this. They are holding back for the moment, because should they provoke any kind of incident right now, all these divisions that we have seen over the last 3 months will disappear.
So let them turn on themselves is their approach at the moment.
Correct. But that doesn't preclude the possibility that a desperate leader who sees a coalition fraying and he can't put Humpty Dumpty together again, that he provokes the incident. And that would take us really into completely uncharted territory. I am very concerned that we are seeing here just a tactical retreat, that he's going to move forward on this because his own personal interests, as Yaakov just said, trump the concern for the consequences for the state of Israel.
Speaking of Trump, there's another leader who's in some
another great one.
Legal difficulty right
yes.
now. Okay, Yaakov, tell us this. We talked about the reservists earlier and about how, for those who don't know, everybody's in the reserve army in Israel. National service is an obligation for everyone. But what about the permanent military, which is one of the most, maybe the most trusted institution in all of Israel, also a huge employer? How has the military reacted to this situation?
Well, it was starting to seep into the standing army, right? It started, as Janice said earlier, in the reservists. You had, for example, those airmen, the first pilots to come out and say they can no longer fly. Those were the people from the 69th Squadron. They fly an airplane called the F-15I. It's the Israeli version of the F-15, one of our most advanced combat aircraft. And these were people who I actually know because I interviewed many of them for a book I wrote about Israel's bombing of a nuclear reactor in Syria back in 2007. And these were people who were courageous. Back then, on September 5th, 2007, they were told that afternoon that night, just as the clock struck midnight, they would be flying off to Syria to bomb a nuclear reactor in a mission that defied imagination. And they didn't hesitate for a second. But then when they made their comment about how they felt they could no longer serve this government, we had ministers from Netanyahu's party who called them cowards, narcissists. One minister said, "Go to hell." Another one, a mouthpiece for Netanyahu in media, said they're like pus that should be uprooted. We've lost our minds here, right? We've lost our minds and the ability to have a dialogue because we have taken up these positions that as if their distress means nothing. So thankfully, it had yet to start in the standing army, but it was beginning to seep in there. And you heard the chief of staff of the Israeli military voicing extreme concern. And the defense minister, when he made his comment calling on Netanyahu on Saturday night, a week and a half ago, to stop, he was sacked because he was seen as standing up to Netanyahu. But his concern came from what's happening to the army. And if we lose the army, Steve, imagine what happens to this country.
Well, okay, let me pursue that because, and I'm not going to pretend for a second that this is a unique observation, but the last time I was in Israel, which is about 4 or 5 years ago, I left the country thinking that the biggest problem Israel had was not Iran and not the Palestinian question and not the economy and not the Arab neighbors, but a civil war within the country itself. Yeah. So let's have some conversation about that right now. Janice, what line needs to be crossed before there is genuine concern that this is a country turning on itself?
I think the line that would provoke that kind of conflict in the streets, we got to the edge of it just before Netanyahu withdrew, was when some of the right-wing ministers called out their supporters into the streets. So we were at the edge of confrontations in the streets between those demonstrators who had been in the streets for 3 months and then those that supported the government. If Netanyahu pushes ahead with this in May, the reason I'm so pessimistic, Steve, the negotiations that Yaakov referred to are under the auspices of the president, but none of the originators of this reform from the government are in those conversations right now. That leads you to think this is a delaying tactic. It's going to take, a miracle to pull this one out.
Not unknown for that part of the world, incidentally.
Not unknown in this part of the world, that's right. But if we get to the point where both communities are so angry and so frustrated, in the kind of language that you hear, you're a traitor, you are betraying the state, we need to snuff you out. If that kind of conversation begins to boil over in the streets, we're in a civil war. We're not far.
Yaakov, could you weigh in on that? How worried are people about a real civil war in Israel right now?
Look, I'm extremely concerned, Steve. I've been living in this country. I came from the United States 30 years ago. I've lived here through intifadas and terrorist attacks, in waves of bus bombings and coffee shop bombings. And I covered the Second Lebanon War up north and saw 4,000 rockets, rain down in Israel, and covered numerous Gaza conflicts and saw Israeli Jews pulled out of their homes in different settlements. So it's been depressing here at times, but nothing like this. This is really a whole new level. And my concern is that, and I thought we were there on Monday when you had people, as Janice described, on the streets. All that was needed was a match to be lit and thrown somewhere that could escalate and go in a direction. It takes one crazy guy to take a gun and lift a weapon and do something, and this spirals out of control when the emotions are so high and the rhetoric is so toxic and the stakes are high. And I think that's where we were. We stepped away from the edge of that cliff for now, but people have not forgotten. And the protesters are getting ready to come out to the streets again if these talks fail and Netanyahu tries to push away. This is a very, very dangerous moment for the state of Israel and the future of this country.
Janice, let me bring the story home a little bit. The Canadian Jewish diaspora tends to be very supportive of who's ever in power. They're obviously watching this very, very carefully. Do you have a sense of where the community's at?
I think you described it so well, Steve. There is there's a reticence to speak out, really based on the fact that the Jews in Canada don't live in Israel, don't bear the costs, and therefore don't feel it's appropriate for them to speak out. Let me say that what has gone on over the last 3 months has broken that taboo for many. There's an anguish in this community as they watch what Netanyahu is doing. There's criticism. There's a fierce debate going on about how loudly people should speak out. Some have. I suspect if Yaakov's description is accurate of what we will face in May, more will speak out. There is a sense of shared values here around democracy, not necessarily liberal democracy and bills of rights. Every democracy has its own characteristics. But were Israel to deviate fundamentally from a commitment to democracy, that would put North American Jewry, which is the most powerful Jewish community outside Israel, in a situation where they would have to choose. And that is a risk, like coming back to what we talked about earlier, is to me astonishing that Netanyahu is literate about North America, understands this is not a minister who's never traveled outside the country. We have some of those, that he would roll the dice the way he's doing it. There's frankly fury here.
Well, let's finish up on him, on the Prime Minister himself. And I don't mean this to sound as flippant as it might. Yaakov, to you first. I remember interviewing Bibi Netanyahu maybe 20 years ago when he was not the Prime Minister. And in our interview, he boldly and confidently predicted he would be again. And he was right. He was again. This man has 9 lives.
He does.
Which political life is he on right now, Yaakov?
10th.
This is the last leg, Steve, of Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is the final act of the show. The question is, how will it end? Will it end with him taking a deal and stepping down, avoiding jail time because of the trial? Will it end with a possible conviction that then he appeals, but then finally his party turns up against him? Will it end with him being toppled because this coalition will not be sustainable and Israel going to another election and either him not succeeding in forming a government or possibility that the party also turns against him? But we're seeing the final days, so-called, that could be over years, of Benjamin Netanyahu's political career. And something has to be said about that. This was a man who has really done tremendous things for the country, whether it's economic reforms, whether it's keeping Israel safe and secure, building out ties, the Abraham Accords with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates and Morocco and Sudan. He deserves a lot of credit, but what he's done in the last 3 months has ripped this country apart in a way that will be difficult to forgive and to forget. And that will be a stain on his legacy for generations to come.
Janice, his 9th life?
His 10th.
His 10th life.
His 10th life. I agree with Yaakov, his 10th life. Look, this is hanging by a thread. There are already 3 Likud ministers. He's got a majority of 4 seats to push this through. So you and I count votes. That's what we do, Steve. 3 ministers have already defected fundamentally and told him they will not vote for this legislation. He has a group of ultra-right-wing ministers who are not going to compromise. It is going to be very difficult for him, weakened now, to keep this coalition together. I don't think he's going to be able to do that. So this is the end for Bibi, one way or the other.
I thank the two of you for joining us tonight on TVO and helping us understand this story so much better. Yaakov Katz, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the U of T. Toda rabah to Yaakov. Janice, thank you so much.
Thank you.
A major art fraud ring was busted recently in Canada, accused of peddling hundreds of fake Norval Morrisseau paintings. That made some people wonder about similar art they own. Charnel Anderson covers the Northwest for Ontario Hubs, and she joins us now from Thunder Bay on what to look for in authentic paintings. Hello, Charnel.
Hey, Dan.
All right, so you looked into how to authenticate a Norval Morriseau painting. First, take us back. How did that come about?
Right. So, I got curious after I heard news of the arrests and, that the police had seized somewhere around 1,000 pieces of phony artwork attributed to Norval Morrisseau. How do you know what's legit and what's not? And then it was kind of serendipity. I got an email from a gentleman named Dwight who had seen my previous reporting. I did a story on the theft of a Norval Morriseau painting from Confederation College in the 80s. And so Dwight reached out, and in his email, he explained that he was born in Madsen near Red Lake, and that his dad had a furniture store there in the late 1960s where Norval would come and trade his paintings for some craft paper. Excuse me. And so his dad got a number of Norval Morriseau paintings this way, and he had given them to his sons. And so that's how Dwight had got his, and he's held on to them for a few decades. And, he's thought about selling them, but in order to do that with, of course, the news of the arrests, you need to establish that it's a genuine Norval Morriseau painting. And so that's sort of how this all started.
Of course, the arrest that you mentioned happened earlier this month. Obviously, a lot of sort of media coverage on this particular case. But for people who don't know who Norval Morriseau is and his work, who is he?
I mean, yeah, so he's arguably the most famous contemporary Indigenous artist in Canada. And, even if you haven't heard his name, you're probably familiar with his style. He's credited with founding the Woodland School of Art, which is characterized by these bright, vivid colors and thick black lines. It's, a style that's really synonymous with Indigenous art, especially here in Northwestern Ontario. And so, when Norval started out, he wasn't that well known, but eventually he was discovered by an artist named Jack Pollock. And he went on to become the first Indigenous artist to have his work shown in a mainstream art gallery. And today he's known as the Mishomis, or grandfather of contemporary Indigenous art.
And of course, the late Norval Morriseau passed away in 2007, but of course his legacy continues. I want to talk a little bit more about the police and their investigation, because this is quite complex in terms of the people behind it. What did police learn about who was selling these fake Norval Morriseau paintings?
That's right. So according to the OPP, there were 3 distinct groups producing and distributing fake Norval Morriseau artwork. The first group allegedly emerged around 1996 in the Thunder Bay area. And that started with one person who, according to police, recruited a full assembly line of painters to produce these paintings. And the second group was also based in Thunder Bay, and they allegedly began their operation around 2002. Police say that this group involved one of Morriseau's nephews. And so this group allegedly sold their paintings online to people around the world. And then there was a third group operated in Southern Ontario, started around 2008. And this group allegedly provided false information for provenances. They produced phony certificates of authenticity and appraisals for these fake paintings. And they also distributed them to unsuspecting members of the public, according to police. None of these allegations have been proven in court, but the hearings have begun for those who've been arrested. And, I'm pretty eager to see how it all unfolds.
One question for you. How many paintings do police estimate are out there that are not real?
So, the number is unknown, but, there's estimates that there could be as many as 6,500 fake artworks attributed to Norval Morriseau.
All right, let's have a look at 2 pieces that Dwight Barnes is trying to authenticate. This is the first one. Tell us what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so this, it appears to be an owl. It's got the thick black outlines characteristic of Norval's style. The colors are relatively muted, and, there's only 2 of them. There's brown and yellow, but it is reminiscent of Norval's earlier works where the colors are toned down, relative to his later work.
And then our next photo.
Yeah, and so the second painting features what looked like to be 3 crows or ravens. Similar to the last painting, it's got muted colors, this time yellow and a deep green or blue, looks green, and brown. And it looks like it could be painted on craft paper, which, again, is a material that Norval used in his earlier works, before he got famous and had access to these more mainstream materials.
Now, in both those photos, there are some characters on the bottom of the images. What does that say?
Yeah, so that's Norval Morrisseau's signature in syllabics. I believe it translates to Copper Thunderbird.
All right. Now, why is it that Morrisseau's art is so difficult to authenticate? You talked about some of the features there in terms of craft paper. There's a very specific way in terms of how he paints in some of his drawings. You talked about the thick borders around some of the imagery there. Why is it so hard?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's something that I asked Carmen Robertson, who is an expert on Norval Morriseau, and she explained to me that Norval really operated outside of the mainstream art world. You know, he was a prolific painter who created upwards of 1,000 pieces of artwork. And, you know, before he started showing and selling his work in art galleries, he was living in Red Lake, where he would create his paintings and then go around town selling them to people or offering to trade them. You know, as Carmen put it, he really operated within this traditional notion of reciprocity or gift giving. And so many people, especially people in Red Lake, ended up with Norval Morriseau paintings this way, really without any formal provenance or certificates of authenticity, which is, you know, what art dealers look for when they're trying to authenticate a piece of artwork. So that's part of the reason that, you know, it's been a challenge to authenticate his artwork.
In terms of Dwight Barnes, do we know? I know he was trying to see if his pieces were authenticated. Has he gotten any word back yet as to whether or not, in fact, he does have some real pieces?
Yeah, not yet. No, he's still waiting to hear. He has reached out to an authenticator, but, you know, this is a process that takes some time. So he's working on it, but we don't know yet.
All right. And in terms of, you know, you had estimated about 6,500 people potentially could have some Norval pieces that are not real. What are the steps for owners who might be looking to learn and find out that their painting is in fact real?
So it's actually pretty straightforward for people that own the paintings. What they need to do is find an appraiser, and ideally that's someone who is familiar if not an expert in the type of work they're getting to evaluated. And this work is a little more complicated for the appraisers, right? They're going to want to see the work. They want any provenance that you may have. So that's either paperwork, certificates of authenticity, that sort of thing. It could even be like a photograph that shows the painting in a room on a certain date. Family stories could work. And so they'll look at the provenance and then they'll look at the artwork itself. They may even do some kind of science, you know, chemical analysis of the paint. They can do radiocarbon dating on wood. And so these methods taken together are really what can allow them to, you know, figure out whether it is a genuine piece of artwork or if it's a fake.
Charno Anderson, thank you again for another great story. Very interesting story. I'm sure there will be plenty of follow-ups to this one.
Thanks so much.
The agenda this week explored the complexities for diaspora communities amid concerns about foreign interference in Canada and reflected on the differences between anger and resentment in politics. The agenda's Week in Review begins looking into the growing problem of kids refusing to go to school. School avoidance or chronic absenteeism, call it what you want, define it. What is it?
That's a good question. Well, it's a complex mental health disability that presents very individually. So each story of school phobia, avoidance, and absence looks quite different.
It's interesting you called it a mental health issue as opposed to kids just screwing off and not wanting to go to school.
Exactly.
So it's not.
And
we're
all
talking the former,
issues
not the latter.
impact mental health and wellness. So, you know, whatever the causes are, the impact and how it presents in young people is intense school-induced anxiety that interferes with a student's ability to access and manage an education.
How much of it's going on right now?
Well, I mean, this is, you know, the rates are increasing. You know, people are tracking attendance more because of COVID and virtual learning. So before the pandemic, this was an issue. In some schools, 20-25%, up to, I've, you know, worked with some schools, 80% of the student population is absent due to mental health challenges and disabilities.
When you say absent, you have to be away for how long for that to constitute?
Yeah, the definition of chronic absence is 2 days a month, so total of about 18 days. a school year. So, so I mean, chronic absence is a huge issue.
Gotcha. Let's look at a quote here. This is Maria Rogers, Canada Research Chair in Child and Youth Mental Health and Well-Being, from a Globe and Mail editorial. Sheldon, I'll ask you to bring this graphic up, and I will read along for those listening on podcast. Chronic absenteeism, which is defined as, here we go, missing 10% or more of school days, about 2 days for each month, had already been extensively studied by education and psychology researchers prior to the pandemic. It has been linked with a multitude of adverse student outcomes, from early to late childhood, poor academic achievement, lower emotional well-being, and early termination from high school. Importantly, high rates of absenteeism among students in the earliest grades can have a snowball effect throughout a child's schooling experience. Students who are chronically absent as early as kindergarten are far more likely to drop out of high school compared with children who are not routinely absent in the early grades. Nathan, pick up the story if you would. How has this worsened thanks to COVID-19?
I think one of the largest challenges is that why are the students absent? I can appreciate your perspective and pointing to mental health, but there must be more reasons than that on the table, especially coming out of a pandemic where we still have illnesses happening within the schools, and we still have teachers that are looking into their classrooms, and the absences are occurring. And whose obligation is it to find out why and to do something about it?
Well, we're going to certainly explore that in our conversation here. Tell us what's at stake academically when you miss a lot of school.
You're behind. You have to catch up, and it creates anxiety for the student, and the teacher then has to try to differentiate, change that programming to accommodate those absences, and it creates stress for not just the student, but the system as a whole. And I'm sure the parents out there who are dealing with a child at home when they should be in school, it's hard for them as well.
DP, can you speak to the mental health angle in this as well, as opposed to, because when we think of kids cutting class, we often think because they'd rather hang out at the mall, or they want to go smoking behind the school and just don't want to go to class. This is not that, what we're talking about here.
Well, I think, my colleagues have pointed to a couple of really important things. The pandemic had a huge impact on students. 3 things come to mind for me. The first is we've seen a rise in mental health issues being reported by children and youth, things like bullying, worried sleep, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, relationship troubles. Secondly, learning gaps, right? We've talked about kids going to school and then being virtual and returning back and masking. That's been difficult. And if you're worried about falling behind with your grades or worried you're not matching up to your peers, you're going to be worried about your success and your future. And then thirdly, I think a lot about socialization, social development. Missing out on school meant you can develop peer networks, develop friendships, you can conflict resolve the same way. Those things contribute to absenteeism, which, as you pointed out, is a sign of something bigger going on. And we have an opportunity to think about that with mental health supports right in the school.
Let me pick up on not just what you miss in terms of academics and grades when you don't go to school, but the social interaction skills you need to develop just by being there. What do you miss out when you miss school?
We're social creatures, right? Our motivation is to go be social, and then learning is a byproduct of that. We know that besides class size, one of the biggest impacts on education is whether or not you perceive that your teacher likes you. Your grades go up when you like your teacher, you like your classmates. And so we send our children off to these institutions that are basically the second social institution of their lives. If they can't find their connection, their purpose, meaningfulness, kind and caring attitudes where they can flourish, then they're going to shut down. And the truth is, there is a culture issue happening at our schools right now. If you feel that they're not safe, if you feel invisible, you're not seen, you're not understood, you're being put through a meat grinder, you're not going to perform. And so I think just the same way that we're seeing that in the workplace, people are quietly quitting and not wanting to come back and go back into the workplace to work. We're seeing students that have said, I could lie in bed and watch YouTube. I can get my work done in a couple of hours in the afternoon and hand it in. I don't really need to show up and put up with the excruciating social environment of our high schools right now. So I think there is a bigger problem that we have to look at, and these are kids trying to self-manage around it.
States are entities of people, and in part, what we need to do is understand how entities of people negotiate, navigate. What are the complexities? What are the indirect and direct ways that decisions are made? What are the cultural forms that take shape? How do we avoid simply putting everyone in a box and generalizing? And what are the ways that we can teach students, that we can teach policymakers, politicians to think complexly about the social problems in our world? And so part of what we do at the University of Toronto, at the Centre, is to teach courses that really allow us to understand some of the most difficult issues of our time and to understand them in relation to particular toolkits, in relation to theories of the global, of the transnational, to think about the ways that history informs contemporary relations and contemporary debates, and to apply in many ways a new architecture, a new conceptual architecture to thinking about contemporary complexities in relation to China, in relation to Russia, in different parts of the African diaspora, in the Caribbean and elsewhere. What are the contexts around which we need to think about refugees? What people are mobile and who isn't as mobile? What are the ways that Canadian foreign policy, in fact, discriminates against particular kinds of people coming from particular regions in the world with particular passports? We teach and really try to emphasize the importance of understanding inequality, including inequality in policymaking. And so there are many diverse issues that are of a geopolitical nature that have to do with deep historical issues, deep political issues, the histories of colonialism, the histories of contemporary state formation, the nature of civil wars, and how those wars have an impact on the refugee problems that we have. And so in many ways, it really is about the assemblage of these various components and complexities of our world, and teaching students, teaching colleagues to really put in place conceptualizations that allow us to make sense of those complexities.
Joanna, let me set up my next question for you by reading a snippet of an op-ed that was in the Globe and Mail recently. Ayman Lau published this, and it's called "To Really Tackle Beijing's Interference, Canada Must Engage with the Chinese Diaspora." And here's the excerpt. Canada's response continues to miss opportunities to engage with the Chinese diaspora and dissident communities who have long been sounding the alarm on the Chinese Communist Party's meddling in our democracy. The status quo represents a silencing on two fronts. While the Chinese diaspora faces increasing anti-Asian sentiment and marginalization in Canada, the baggage of another home has followed them across oceans. Okay, can I just get you to react to that?
Yeah, I really agree with Ayman. It's not a controversial take. It's pretty much a factual description of what has been going on for a long time. You see that in panels on TV talking about the CSIS leaks about China. For over a month, a Chinese person did not appear on some of the major networks. And it's as if it's okay and mainstream to not even notice that Chinese Canadian experts and voices aren't speaking at all and being part of the conversation. When these are exactly the voices I think we need to hear from, because people in the communities tend to have that nuance and context that people say are sometimes missing in conversations. So it's definitely, like the panelists have said today, a structural issue in Canada of marginalization of diaspora voices. And it shows that it's not just a issue of being politically correct or polite. It's actually a pretty crucial matter of policymaking, that we have people who know what they're talking about, helping to contribute to policymaking and public awareness and understanding of these issues. As a journalist, most of my sources on these issues on China are clearly people of Chinese descent or people who have worked and lived in China. That kind of experience in China, as complex a place as it is very crucial. And Canada lacks a lot of the structural pathways for students and people in government to gain this knowledge independently. So Chinese Canadians are a huge resource that are being untapped right now and feeling ignored, and some people feeling like the risk of speaking out isn't worth it because, like Ayman wrote, They risk kind of the stereotyping and anti-Asian racism. Personally, if I try to add some nuance to the conversation, I've been called a CCP, pro-China shill, China hugger, spy, agent, like all of these words thrown out at me. And on the other side, if you are critical and you're actually working with the Canadian government, trying to help come up with solutions or just, passing on information from your communities, there's also the real threat of surveillance and intimidation, and real concrete actions from the Chinese state to try to silence you. So the people that we do hear from publicly, you have to appreciate that they're actually taking a great risk in doing so.
Right. Anna, I wonder if I can ask you, given that this country is set to welcome 500,000 new immigrants per year over the next, few years, how do you think all of the issues that we've been talking about today need to evolve in order to deal with that new reality?
Well, I think everyone should study diaspora studies, right, Kamari?
Little plug for your department there,
A little plug for our center. No, because I think diasporas and immigrants and refugee experience are becoming central Canadian experience. Every story you covered right now is history of Canada. And I think sooner the society will understand that actually studying diasporic individuals, our students at the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies are mostly first and second generation Canadian. I'm hoping that because we turned our face to new Canadians and older Canadians with their diasporic roots, we will have a better society, healthier society where people understand each other, celebrate differences, and and don't suspect each other with double alliances and all this kind of stuff that was hurting and poisoning lives of a lot of people.
I remember getting called into the principal's office in, I think it was 7th or 8th grade, and being told, "You're angry, kid." And that's okay, but what you do with that anger matters a great deal. And so you can distinguish, to be a little more precise about the effects of that anger. It can become productive. It can be channeled into, for instance, assessing the state of not just your own situation, but the sort of structural problems that developed in the first place. Or it can create a kind of backlash against other people. It can build solidarity and movement for change, or it can result in a kind of turning inwards and, as I mentioned, a lashing out, which, for instance, might lead to, let's say, occupying the capital city of a country and staying there for weeks. So it matters a great deal what kind of form that takes. And in the social media age, the digital media age, there's a sort of tendency by elites, political elites, media elites, business elites, to try to harness a lot of that anger for their own ends, which ends up producing lots of toxic outcomes. And I was worried a great deal that where we were, elites were corralling folks in very, very dangerous ways that were going to pay off in very, very dangerous outcomes.
Well, let me do a quick follow-up with you since you mentioned the January 6th insurrection. Are you saying left-wing anger good, but right-wing anger bad?
Well, I would say that as a market socialist, wouldn't I? But there isn't anything inherently right or wrong about left or right-wing anger. But I would say contemporary history, not so contemporary history as well, often bears out the case that there are forms of right-wing anger that are extraordinarily toxic, left-wing too, but on balance they tend to manifest in very different ways, although not universally. I would still say the preponderance of right-wing anger has been more toxic and destructive than left-wing anger, but that's a whole different episode maybe.
Indeed. Teresa, you've been writing about resentment for quite a time. Somebody you quoted calls it a psychological dynamite that threatens democracy. Why do you think?
Yeah. So there is a difference between resentment and ressentiment, which is an even more toxic, more hateful kind of resentment. And it can be a dynamite because what it does is it disengages the individuals that are experiencing this emotional mechanism from their own reality, the reality that is causing the frustrations, the pain, the grievances that they are reacting emotionally to. So although grievances highlight the frustrations and the need to address them socially and politically, the emotional responses that come out of that context are not ones that are conducive to pro-social solutions. They lean towards more antisocial preferences, more antisocial behaviors, which in the end compromise and stall the progress that they seek to invite. So they are counterproductive for their own, but they are dynamite for society in a sense that they have this tendency to undo what is already there.
Agnes, let me put some of your words back to you and have you explain what you meant by them. Because you've written, there are two problems with anger. It is morally corrupting and it is completely correct. Okay, explain.
Yeah, so I think the distinction between good and bad anger, as it's been drawn by David and Teresa, has been forward-looking. What do you do with the anger? But another question is, where did the anger come from? That is, what are your reasons for being angry? And sometimes we genuinely have reasons for being angry. So like the good anger would presumably be the anger where you had a reason, you were in fact justified, wrong was committed against you. And the problem is that if you have such a reason, you have that reason forever. That is, if the fact that somebody treated you unjustly is a reason to be angry, that never changes because the fact can't change because you can't go back in time. And that means there's a certain kind of rationality to like holding on to grudges. And the rational structure that kind of naturally creates in your soul is one where the other person's bad becomes your good.
And that is just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, TVO.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or on our Twitter feed. That's twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, March 31st, 2023. Monday, Thomas d'Aquino, once perhaps the most influential lobbyist in the country, is here on his new memoir, Private Power, Public Purpose. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at TVO.org. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you back here again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.